You're watching the PoliticIt podcast.
Good evening. Welcome to PoliticIt podcast. We've got Kelvyn Cullimore back with us. You know, I really wanted to talk to you again after, you know, when I heard there's been a lot of play with the Trump administration in this most favored nation clause that they talk about with the drug companies, and that's why I wanted to talk to you again. Kind of let's talk about that and really what impact that would have. Right.
I appreciate that. And by the way, thanks for having me back. I mean, that's always a good sign.
Yeah.
I didn't blow it the first time.
Well, actually, that podcast did really well. It got a lot of viewers, and a lot of interesting things came up in there. But yeah. I think this is something that's pretty hot in the news right now.
It is, and President Trump's doing a lot of things to try and shake things up, which I think is a good thing. But we had that pill penalty that we talked about last time.
So where did that go? It seems like they've kind of backed off of that a little bit.
Well, there's still support for it. President Trump still supports it. It just didn't make it into the big, beautiful bill.
Right.
And so that just means they'll have to find a different vehicle forward. But I think it will get addressed because it has bipartisan support. So. Yeah,
and the idea there, just so we can review that for people, the idea with the pill penalty is that because of the way the patents run, for some reason now there's a favor to these large molecule.
Yeah, and it actually came about because of the Inflation Reduction Act, where they basically came in and said, we're going to set a date after which we can negotiate a price for your product. If you're a large molecule drug, we're going to give you 13 years. If you're a small molecule or a pill, it's going to be 9 years.
And that's why it's called the pill penalty, really.
Yeah, because why are we doing it different? They should all be 13 years. And everyone agrees that was just...
So you think that's still going to come back in?
I do believe it will. Yeah, I think that will come back.
See, I was thinking they were going to wind that into this.
We were too. We were hoping it was going to be. In fact, there was talk about it, but then all of a sudden this most favored nation thing pops up and it starts to take all the air out of the room. So
right. Well, and the idea behind this most favored nation with respect to pharmaceuticals, basically it says the U.S. has to get the best deal. Or at least as good a deal as everybody else, right?
Yeah, and so on May 12th, President Trump issued an executive order, which seems to be his favorite tool, basically saying, look, we're tired of foreign countries freeloading on the United States, carrying the burden of research and development for all of these drugs. We do all the heavy lifting, we pay the higher prices so that we can get all these nice new drugs to save lives, improve lives, and then foreign countries come in and cherry pick and don't pay their fair share. And so it's not unlike his argument with NATO, where he was trying to say, hey, you were supposed to be paying 2% of your GDP towards military. You haven't been doing that. I want you to start stepping up and doing your share. It's kind of the same thing here. He's saying, look, foreign countries, you should be helping to shoulder this burden. Unfortunately, the tool he's trying to use to compel that is punitive to the pharmaceutical industry in the United States.
Well, why are some countries getting lower prices on drugs?
It is all about how countries go about providing health care. So in the United States, we have a free market system. Foreign countries are socialist systems. They dictate it. And it's not just drugs. I mean, if you look at the cost of any kind of health care in the United States, we pay significantly more for health care in the United States than they do in foreign countries. That's because foreign countries, through a socialist model, control that pricing. Yes, we pay more for drugs here, but we also pay more for hospital, we pay more for doctors. Anything to do with healthcare is much more expensive here than it is elsewhere. Drugs are an easy one to pick on right now because there's a price point that is very well defined. And they look at it and say, why would a drug that costs $100 in the United States be sold for $30 over in Europe? The answer is because those countries negotiate that price as a country and say, that's all we're going to pay.
And from the drug company's perspective, they can either sell that drug or not sell that drug.
Yeah, and it puts them in a little bit of a moral dilemma, because do they say, oh, we know our drug would save lives over here, but if you're not willing to pay our price, we're going to withhold it. And that's a tough thing to do. And so as a result, many of them will sell. But that said, it's important to understand, let me just quote a statistic here, of new cancer drugs launched between 2011 and 2019, 96% are available in the United States, compared with only 71% in the United Kingdom, 59% in Japan, 29% in New Zealand. So it's very clear that these socialist models, they don't adopt all the drugs, and not all the drug companies will sell into that model. We get the benefit of all the product that gets produced, even though we have to pay a higher price.
So that's what happens then, is the drug companies will say, yeah, we're not going to sell that drug for that price.
Some of them have said that. Others, the countries have said, we're not going to buy that drug.
Because it's too expensive.
Because it's too expensive, even at a discount, because they use a system called quality of life years, where basically they say, well, yeah, this might help someone, but we don't think it extends their life enough that we're going to pay for it. And so they start becoming judges as to how much benefit their citizens can get from a product.
Well, and that's something I think people should be aware of in terms of socialized medicine, right?
Yes.
That those kinds of decisions are made
right.
to keep the cost down.
Right. And availability of product, availability of services is much different in a socialized medicine. But all that said, we understand why there's frustration over that. If you go back before certain legislation in the United States, one called the Hatch-Waxman bill, that made a clear path for pharmaceutical development in the United States. Pharmaceutical development was basically being done in Europe. Europe came in and started clamping down on what they would pay for those drugs. Now there is virtually no R&D of new drugs in Europe.
Because the companies just can't make a profit at that.
They can't. And that's the other thing that's interesting is when you talk about drugs, 90% of drugs that are used in the United States are generic drugs that are sold for a very small price, very comparable, and in many cases below what they pay in foreign countries, because in our market system, when you have competition, it drives down the price. In socialist countries, it's just a fixed price.
Yeah, they just decide
so
what the price is.
On 90% of the drugs, we get very good pricing. We're talking about 10% of drugs that are the high-profile drugs, the new drugs that are life-changing, life-saving, that are getting all the attention.
And some of those we provide in other countries, and some of them that we don't.
That's correct. And so the most favored nation is saying, we're going to take a market basket of 5 countries that are part of of a coalition that say what the average price is in those countries, we're going to set that price here. Well, that's nothing more than price controls. If we're going to do that here, are we also next going to start telling doctors what they can charge, hospitals what they can charge? I mean, price controls, government price controls have never been the answer.
Well, and certainly if you, I mean, many of us lived through that with the gas prices, right? When they tried to put a price cap on gasoline, what happened? You just had lines at gas stations.
That's right. That's right. So, are there solutions? Yes, there are. Because our drug development process is very expensive. There's just no question about it. If we had implemented this kind of price control 10 years ago or so, there's a study that shows there was 110 drugs that we would not have today.
If we'd have done that.
Because it would have taken the R&D money out of the system, and there would be 110 drugs that did not get developed.
Well, and you brought up last time when we talked about this pill penalty, is that R&D budgets have shifted to these large molecule drugs, which actually cost people a whole lot more money,
yes.
right?
Yeah,
because they have to be administered in the hospital, right?
Right. Or hospital or in a clinic. Right.
Yeah. So hey, we're going to take a break and we'll come back.
All right.
Tired of media bias? Frustrated by political noise? PoliticIt.com cuts through the clutter, giving you real facts, clear analysis, and unbiased insight on the issues that matter most. Stay informed, stay empowered. Whether it's elections, policy changes, or breaking news, we've got you covered. No spin, no agendas, just truth you can trust. Visit PoliticIt.com today, because informed citizens shape the future. PoliticIt.com, where politics meets clarity.
Welcome back to PoliticIt. We've got Kelvyn Cullimore back with us. So let's talk a little bit about why are the drug prices the way they are? I mean, the big thing is people just think these pharmaceutical companies are just printing money, right? And so tell me some of the things that are going on that.
Well, one of the challenges we face is it's easy to point out that we pay more for a drug here than is paid in a foreign country. But what we don't see are the systems that go into delivering that drug to the patient. Much more direct systems, perhaps, in a socialist environment. Here, we have what is called PBMs, or pharmacy benefit managers. And pharmacy benefit managers get a rebate on the sale price of the drugs. So they create the formulary that insurance companies adopt. They do the negotiation on what the drug companies will pay. And in the negotiation of that, they also negotiate a rebate to them. So those rebates can be as high as 50% or more.
So do those rebates go to the benefit manager or do they go to the pharmacies? How does that work?
They go primarily to the pharmacy benefit manager. There are some kickback programs to pharmacies, but one of the problems is these pharmacy benefit managers and things also create their own pharmacies, mail-in pharmacies, and force people to buy from those pharmacies. And what you're seeing across the country is the demise of the local pharmacy. It's harder and harder for local pharmacies to stay in business because of the system, the way it's designed. But those rebates end up in the pockets of primarily the pharmacy benefit managers. So when someone pays $100 for a drug, people think that's all going to the pharmaceutical company, when in reality,
50 of that
may be going right to the pharmacy benefit manager, and then you've got a wholesale distributor in there who takes another cut of it. And in the end, by the time you calculate what the drug company itself is actually making, it's significantly less than that sale price.
So if they're if the pharmaceutical company is negotiating with a foreign country that is the only buyer, right? There's not a market, so they may actually be getting as much money on some of those drugs that are cheaper,
because there is no burden of rebates associated with those. There is that factor, so that could play a role in why the pricing is lower there. They have a very different system for distribution of the drugs than we have in the United States. And that's important to keep in mind. When we talk about lowering the price of drugs, you have to peel back the layers of the onion to say, who
pays that?
Yeah, who is paying for this? And is it really the drug company? It's an easy narrative to say greedy big pharma is making all this money. And they do well. Although I will say, only about 10% of pharmaceutical companies are actually profitable. 90% are not, because they're in the R&D phase. When they finally develop a new drug, they often sell out to one of the 10% that are profitable, and they're the ones who take it to market. But the challenge that we have with a lot of this is that you have to peel back the onion to see where are the real costs that are driving pharmaceutical costs, and can we do something about that? If we were to eliminate PBMs, for instance, and eliminate rebates altogether, what would our pricing look like? In other words, there are many other alternatives to finding better pricing for drugs than simply imposing government price controls.
So what would be some suggestions for legislators in terms of being able to get a better handle on this? I mean,
well, first of all, it's a matter of understanding the system. And admittedly, it's a complex system, and it needs to be simplified. Everybody agrees it needs to be simplified. So that's part of it. Part of it is saying, is there legislation that can be done to simplify it? We have a company here in Utah who's taking a very simple approach. They're called Civica Rx, they're a division of Intermountain Health.
And that's a nonprofit, right?
They are a nonprofit, and they are a drug manufacturer. And they are manufacturing products that are in short supply and trying to bring prices down, and it's working. They're now over 30 drugs that they have on the market, and all generics, and they're just doing it, and it just shows that there are methods beyond government regulation to bring pricing down. And I applaud what Civica has done on that.
And that's a Utah company.
That's a Utah company. Intermountain Health. Yeah.
So does Intermountain Health own that, or they just spun it off as another nonprofit?
They still have ownership in it. It's not 100% subsidiary, but they still have strong ownership, and they were the ones who fostered the development of that company. So, yeah.
And they don't do R&D on new drugs. They basically figure out ways of providing, like insulin, for instance.
Yeah.
That's
they do generics. They do generics and drugs that are off patent.
Yeah, and what's happened with a lot of those too? I've noticed sometimes I've gone to the pharmacy and I said, why don't you just give me the generic? And they said, well, because the pharmaceutical version of it actually is cheaper. Yeah. Which is kind of interesting, right?
Sometimes that occurs. That's why it's a strange market. It requires some real significant understanding, and I think there are ways to bring the pricing down. It's just pharmaceuticals are an easy target right now, and the most favored nation approach would take $1 trillion out of the pharmaceutical market in the United States and essentially eviscerate investment in
well, and that's something that people don't realize is that when you talk about the amount of capital that it takes to bring a pharmaceutical drug to market, you have to realize that there's competition for those dollars, right? And right now, a lot of those dollars are going into AI stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, people are chasing the best potential benefit to them.
Absolutely, and the big challenge is with pharmaceuticals, there's a lot higher risk profile of failure. So for every one that succeeds, there's probably 10 that did not, but there was a significant investment in those 10 as well. So that burden is being picked up by the one that was successful. And that ends up costing a lot of money to bring the drug to market.
So what should the public know?
Well, the public should, obviously, I'm a spokesperson for the industry, so
right.
You would expect me to say this, that the situation is much more complex than it appears. To recognize that in the United States, because of our market system, we have access to significantly better healthcare, and even though it's more expensive, but that's our market, and it's everything from hospitals to doctors to pharmaceuticals, all of that. But we have access to everything here. So you go outside the United States, they don't have that. That's number one. Number two, we have been paying more because our system is very different. We don't do price controls, and so it's what the market will bear. The other thing is to understand that the cost of what they're paying at the counter is not all going to the pharmaceutical company. There are many people in that.
Yeah, this pharmacy benefit manager thing that you talked about, that was something I wasn't really familiar with.
Yeah, there should be more transparency. Norm Thurston ran some bills to try and create more transparency in the state of Utah on PBMs. It didn't go very far. Would like to see more of that kind of thing, but there are things that can be done. And people should know that because of the system we have, while there are expensive drugs, they are drugs that would not be there but for the system that we have. So lives are being saved, lives are being improved by drugs that are the product of this system. If we eviscerate the R&D dollars that are going into that, 20 years from now, we're going to be saying, how come we don't have any new drugs to fight this?
Yeah, good point. Well, thanks for coming in.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for shining a light on this.
Yeah, well, thank you. And we'll see you guys next week.